Okay, welcome to lesson number 2, learning objective 1-2, which is all about graphing. Our objective on this one is to learn how to graph data with appropriate scales and the variables on the correct axes. I want to highlight that the goal here is all about the scale of your data and also having your variables on the correct axes. So some tips. When drawing great graphs, the first thing you need to do is select the scale. If you don't know what I mean by scale, look at this y-axis here. Notice that it goes from 0 to 20, and then from 20 to 40, 40 to 60, and that your highest value is 160. That is what I'm talking about when I say a scale. All graphs have to have a consistent scale on the y-axis and a consistent scale on the x-axis. The scale on the x-axis is different from the scale on the y-axis, but they are both consistent. So that's what we mean when we talk about scale. So when choosing a scale, you're usually going to start with a data table like this. And so the first thing you need to do is you need to look at the maximum values. For the x-axis over here, gap width, I've got a maximum value of 10. For pennies, I have a maximum value of 150. And so the key here is that your scale should always go high enough to represent the maximum value. And in physics, we usually also want to make sure that our scale goes low enough to represent 0. So you usually want to have that there also. What we mean, another way to say that is that the scale should always show the origin or the 0 value. Okay, fancy word for that is right here, origin. Okay, so you always want to have both of those. Next thing we need to do is we want to make sure to label everything. So we always want to label the data table and the graph with the variable's name and also its unit. So an example over here is we listed that this variable was going to be gap width. I'm going to highlight this in orange. It would be gap width in centimeters. Actually, let me change that. Let's highlight this in blue because it is the independent variable. Gap width in centimeters. And this is going to be pennies. And the unit we're using is the number of pennies. So I'm just using that little, it's actually called a pound sign. You might think of it as a hashtag or the number symbol, but it just means the number of things. Also on the graph, I'm using the same symbols. So I gave the name, pennies, and the unit, which is number. And in this one, name, gap width, and the unit, centimeters. You got to make sure you have both, because otherwise you're not fully explaining what you're graphing. Okay, so that is how we pick a good scale, how we label our graph. The last thing is knowing what thing goes on which axis. Well, the rule here, down here at the bottom, is that the independent variable always goes on the x-axis. There will be a couple times in this class when we sort of flip that around and change it in order to make a certain goal, but that is the general rule. The dependent variable, therefore, always goes on the y-axis. All right, and just to make sure that's clear on here, we have pennies, which is our dependent variable on the y-axis, and then we have gap width, which is our independent variable on the x-axis.